excited that we have a guest on S.A. Cosby. He's an acclaimed and award-winning author of horror, science fiction, fantasy, and thrillers. This Renaissance man is the voice behind one of the best books I've read this year, Blacktop Wasteland. I'm a huge fan. Sean, welcome to Thriller Talk.
Well, thank you guys for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Sean, the tension for the protagonist in the Blacktop Wasteland derives from everyday pressures. You have a son who needs braces, a daughter wanting to attend college, a mother in need of expensive care, and a financially struggling business. The direct life and death challenges of a heist almost feels like a relief or an escape in the face of Beauregard's normal world. Can you tell us a little bit about why you set the novel up that way?
I wanted to have a comparison in his regular life versus his criminal life. I wanted to set up a dichotomy that shows that the tension and stress of a criminal life is counterbalanced by the tension and stress of just what everyday life can be and what a lot of people, especially people on the lower end of the economic scale, go through. And by creating that dichotomy between those two extremes, you get to see the full width and breadth of Beauregard as a character.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. They always say, with writing coaches to make things tough on your characters, to put them in trees and then start throwing rocks at them. Well, I think you threw a few boulders. So great job. And so anyways,
Thank you so much.
Pleasure. The setting of Blacktop Wasteland is very different from traditional heist settings, like New York City, LA, Vegas, or large European cities. But the intimacy of Red Hill County makes the story so much more intense than a big city could ever be. How does Red Hill shape both the characters who live there and the action that takes place?
Red Hill is like a lot of small towns, like the small town I grew up in, where the interconnected tissue of the relationships and the rivalries and everything that works together creates this tapestry that draws all the characters within each other to each other. Growing up in a small town in the South like I did, you're only 4 degrees of separation away from everybody else. You either went to school with somebody's cousin who used to date somebody's sister, or you dated somebody's sister who's actually stepsister to your best friend's mom. So it's all interconnected. And because it's like that, the slights cut deeper and the passions are more intense because you can't avoid people. Like if you're in a big city and you have a problem with somebody in Brooklyn and you live in Manhattan, well, you may never see that person again for the rest of your life. But if you live in a small town, even if you live in a small tri-county area, you may run into people that you have issues with, or as like for the characters in Blacktop Wasteland, characters, you may run into people that you have life and death confrontations with. And so it creates this really powerful pressure cooker of character reactions in that kind of really tight-knit small town environment. And I'm not the first person to do that. I mean, it goes all the way back to Dashiell Hammett and Red Harvest, or Daniel Woodrell with Winter's Bone. So writers way more talented than I have taken that as a setting and use it to tell their story.
Sean, you touched on some of this just a little just now, but I want to go a little deeper if you don't mind. So family's a key theme of Blacktop Wasteland, and you handle the theme in such a unique and satisfying way. How did you go about building the fictional web of relationships, and did the plot influence those relationships, or was it the other way around?
I think it was the other way around. One of the things that I do when I write, I like to create pretty extensive biographies for the characters and 99% of that stuff never makes it into the book, but I like to create a background story, origin stories for each character, especially characters that are on screen a lot, so to speak. And so, if you ask me, well, Ronnie and Reggie, what were they like as kids? And Ronnie looked out for Reggie, but he also took advantage of him. If you ask me what Beauregard, and Beauregard doesn't have any brothers or sisters, but he grew up with his first cousins, Kelvin and Caden, and so they were like his brothers. And so he has a great deal of affection for them. He sees Booney as a father figure, even though his own father had disappeared. And so using that as a background, it sort of allows you to create a shorthand when you're describing the relationship between the characters. I don't have to tell you that Kelvin and Caden and Beauregard all, lost their virginity within 6 weeks of each other. But I can tell, you can tell, and hopefully the reader can tell by the way Kelvin and Beauregard interact with each other, that they're the type of men who would share that secret, that would talk to each other about that. I don't have to tell you that Booney, looked at Anthony, Beauregard's father, as his own brother. And so he feels responsible for Beauregard. But I can show you that through the dialogue and their interactions. And so it creates this background noise for me that I can use to give the reader a shortcut into these relationships.
Yeah, I thought it was incredibly masterful how every single family member had a pivotal role in this story. That's what I really enjoyed. You could just, like I said, I keep thinking about the book afterwards, which I think is a huge compliment because, it stays with you and you start, as an author as well, you puzzle to like the choices you made and we're very, very impressed. Your actual prose is breathtakingly good, very lyrical, poetic. I wonder, did you write like poetry or music, or is this just your natural style?
I thank you for that. I appreciate that. That's slightly embarrassing, but I am a huge fan of poetry and music and songwriters. I think I consider songwriters like Bruce Springsteen is one of our great American writers, even though he writes songs. And so, Dwayne and the Allman Brothers, great songwriters are like Smokey Robinson. So that type of lyrical description and descriptive prose is something that really I appreciate as a fan. Also, like I said, I'm a huge fan of poetry. So I love reading the great, 20th century poets, T.S. Eliot, Nikki Giovanni, earlier poets like Phillis Wheatley, great older, poets from antiquity, like Homer and Iliad and, Dante's Inferno and stuff like that. And so I love that type of writing, Emily Dickinson and writers of that nature. So great poets, Langston Hughes is a huge influence of mine, Count T. Cullen and the great writers of the Harlem Renaissance. And so I've never understood the idea that crime writing and crime fiction writing can't be beautiful, that because you're describing these horrific, these physically horrific, incredibly visceral acts doesn't mean that the language in which you describe them can't be beautiful and moving and sensory dependent. You talk about taste, touch, feel, smell. I don't ascribe to that. There are some writers, crime writers especially, who write in a very utilitarian way because it's really about the plot. It's not so much about the characters, the characters are chess pieces. And I wanted to write in a way that was evocative of the character's feelings. And so when I write a line like, there's sparks flying up from the ramp that Beauregard has to drive up and it washed over the car like a wave made of falling stars. I don't do that just to be like, oh, look at me, I can write. I want you as a reader to feel what a character like Beauregard is feeling. When I write about the pain and agony of being poor and being afraid of when the phone rings, I want you to feel and think the way Ronnie Sessions is feeling. And so creating that kind of, verbiage and syntax and patois is something that I find helps the story along. It helps the narrative. It helps differentiate it from other crime fiction novels.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I felt like you had a very, very powerful voice, and each point of view was also a different experience. So you felt like you were really in that character's head and their world. Well done.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Sean, while there's a fair bit of violence in your work, it always comes from this place of strong emotion, which is, by the way, very emotionally satisfying. How do you build such an intimate connection between violence and emotion?
Every act of violence has consequences in real life and in fiction. And so whenever I have a character commit an act of violence or have an act of violence committed upon them, I like to reinforce the consequences of that. If Beauregard gets shot in the arm and rolls down a hill and cracks his head open, he doesn't immediately get up and shake it off and keep running. If there's a scene in the book that, for example, where he's torturing someone for information, and I tried really hard to show that he takes no pleasure in that he's not a sadist, that he doesn't enjoy, even though he has a legitimate gripe with this person, he doesn't enjoy hurting them. And at the end of this particular scene, when this person tells him, I'm scared, he, in his own way, tries to comfort them. There's nothing to be afraid of, just close your eyes. And some people take that as, oh, that's a real badass line. It's very Jules Winterfield. But it's also very emblematic of who Beauregard is as a person, because beneath his tough exterior, beneath his bluster, and beneath his ability to compartmentalize the violent acts that he commits, I think at his core, he is a kind-hearted person, as kind-hearted as circumstances will allow him to be. On the other hand, you look at somebody like Ronnie, when he commits an act of violence, again, it has repercussions and consequences that he maybe didn't anticipate, and those consequences come to fruition. And for me, when I write about violence, I feel like I want it to mean something. I don't like throwaway violence. I want the violence to cause a equal and opposite action and reaction within the character who perpetrates it and the character that is perpetrated upon. I think that makes it feel more real, because in real life, violence, it costs a lot. And so whether it's monetarily or emotionally. And so I want my characters to experience they have to pay that same price.
Yeah, it felt very gritty and realistic too. Like you said, there are some thrillers, where, the guy takes on 12 guys and takes them all down. And, it's this long drawn out fight. And I liked how gritty and realistic yours were, very short and sharp. And like you said before, if you get hit in the head with a wrench, you're probably going down.
Yeah. I've been hit in the face before. You don't shake that off. So
Yeah. So I come from a very car crazy family, and I love to drive fast. So I particularly love those aspects. What's your dream ride?
it is a 67 black Impala with chrome rally rims and black leather interior and a 405 engine. That's my dream ride. I would
like how
love to
fast
have
you knew that answer, by the way. Like you definitely gave this one some thought before just right now, right? Yeah, that was pretty quick.
I love that car. That's one of my favorite cars. I love American muscle cars because I think they're metaphorically and physically emblematic of a sense and time and place in America where freedom was just behind the wheel of a car. And I don't know, with social media, with our overabundance of security measures that we have now, I don't know if that's true anymore. I think there was a time when you could jump in a car and hit Route 66 and literally change your life, start over again. And and that's not a bad thing or a good thing. It's just things change. But I do think that those cars are emblematic of that, especially growing up where I grew up. Having a car is one of those things that is a sign of equanimity. Doesn't matter if you're in a small southern town with Confederate statues and you're an African American man or woman. If you've got enough money, you can buy a nice car and you can trick it out if you want to. You may have a house that's maybe not as good as someone else's house, or you may not have the financial fluidity that your neighbors have, but you damn sure can shine your car and put a candy apple coat of paint on it. And for a little while, you can feel good about yourself, no matter despite your circumstances. And I think that's why Americans fall in love with cars. I think, if you dissect racism and classism, the equality again comes down to what we own, unfortunately. And one of the easiest things to acquire is a car. You can get a car before you get a house. And so I grew up around folks who may have lived in a single wide mobile home, but come Saturday night, they'd soup up that Camaro or that Chevelle or that Duster and ride down to what we call the strip, but really it was just our 2-lane highway that cuts through the town area, past the courthouse, past the grocery store, past the one Tasty Freeze, and you drive that strip over and over again. And for a little while, you didn't feel so put upon and oppressed. Yeah, you might get pulled over by the cops because you're driving while black, but for a little while, like I said, you felt like you were a man or a woman, and you felt just the same as everyone else. We were the same as everyone else, but that car sometimes was the way to symbolize that. And so I think that's why I think Americans are in love with cars, and why I love writing about vehicles. I don't write about them in everything I write, but when I do I tend to pay a lot of attention to the details.
That was
You have me ready to go buy a car right now, like American Muscle. I'm this close. Want to go soup it up. Also, if you ever don't want to write books anymore, I'm pretty sure you just pitched a car commercial early on in that answer right there. So you can probably add that right to your resume. Yeah, if someone doesn't call you for that car commercial, that would be a real a tragedy, because I already saw it in my head when you said it. It's a great answer, man.
Yeah, totally. And also, just on that note, can you go into more depth? How did you get those scenes in the book so realistic? I mean, is it something you can tell us? No.
So when I was a kid, my cousin, who's no longer with us, he's actually a little bit of inspiration for Bogart. He was a Mozart of motors. He never trained. He never went to a technical school. He just was somebody that was born knowing how to turn wrenches and screwdrivers. And he had a 68 or a 69 Maverick. And he used to go to the other side of our town, and they would have, I hate calling them illegal, unsanctioned drag races. And when I was about 12, 13, I started sneaking out of the house, and he would pick me up, and we would go to these drag races. And I sometimes rode along shotgun with him in the car. And there is an unbridled, unparalleled feeling of excitement when you're behind the wheel of basically a rocket on wheels, that, a vehicle that can go from 0 to 75 in 2.5 seconds. When you feel the crush of G-forces in your chest, when you can't lean forward, when the outside world is zipping by, like melted wax. And there's
Let's see if he comes back, because I really want the rest of this answer. I'm ready to buy American Muscle and take it drag racing.
But sorry. But anyway, that was I lived that life. I had a cousin who drag raced, and so when I talked about the scenes, the car chase scenes in the book, I wanted to recreate that feeling, that adrenaline rush of of being behind the wheel of that type of machine, and that incredible just exultation that you feel when you're doing something a little bit illegal, a little bit wrong, but the joy that you feel outweighs the illegality of it. And so I tried to translate that to the book.
That's another great answer, man. Sean, what obstacles have you faced on your writing journey? And what advice do you have for new writers who are trying to get their foot in the door?
First of all, I'll give these 3 pieces of advice before my signal drops again. 1, develop a really thick skin if you're a writer, if you want to be a writer, because not everybody's going to like what you write. Sometimes you're not going to like what you write. But if you feel like this is what you're meant to do, then you have to be able to suffer the slings and arrows. I have had a lot of different jobs, but I've never felt that I was really good at anything but writing. And that's not an egotistical statement. I don't mean to say I'm the best writer. I don't mean to say that I'm better than anyone else, but writing is the one thing that feels natural for me. And so I got to a point where no matter how many people kept telling me no, I just kept looking for that one yes. And it sucks. It sucks. My first detective book got rejected 63 times. And it's hard when 63 people tell you that you don't have the talent to do what you feel like you've been put on earth to do. So you have to develop a thick skin. Second, and it's an old saw, but I think it's true, you have to read a lot. You have to read. I am not one of those people that think you can just write without reading, because what reading does for you, it tells you what you can do, what you can replicate, and what you don't want to do. If you read a book that's incredible, if you read a book that makes you angry, it's so good, then you have a high bar to try to attain. On the other hand, if you read a book that doesn't succeed, you can see what pitfalls to avoid. And third, get you some writer friends. Get you some friends that understand what it feels like to be up at 3 o'clock in the morning and trying to find a synonym for equanimity and what it means when you feel that rhythm that you've gotten the right word and how it falls into place. As far as my obstacles, you know, I don't say this for sympathy's sake, but I had a, you know, I had a, so sorry.
No, you're back. It's
Um,
fine.
let me say that real quick. I don't say this for sympathy's sake, but I grew up really in a really poor environment. My mom and dad separated when I was at an early age. Our house burned down. We had to move with my grandparents. I don't say that that was bad because I love my grandparents and I love the environment I grew up in. I grew up around my grandmother and my mother, who were two women who loved to read, and so I grew up developing a love of reading. We didn't have cable. We only had 3 channels, but my grandmother was a huge Harlequin romance fan, and my mom loved reading Greek mythology, and so I grew up in that kind of household. But it was hard. My mom was disabled, and so I went to college. So that's why the signal is so weak. I apologize. Um, but I would just say real quick, I grew up. I went to college. My mom was already disabled when I went to college. She got further illnesses. I had to drop out. I did never return to college. So I'm a college dropout, but I just love reading and I love writing, and I always felt like this was what I was put on earth to do. And so, um, you know, after 20 odd years of, when I turned 23 was when I really decided I was going to be serious about writing. I took classes and things of that nature. And so after 20 some odd years, I have a book that comes out that people seem to enjoy. It's never too late. It's never too late, even though it feels like that sometimes. And so those are some, it's weird when you get people that want to talk to you about your book. And, I don't have an MFA, I don't have a college degree, but people seem to really enjoy the book. And that's what you write for. At the end of the day, I want to get paid, but at the end of the day, you write because you want people to enjoy your work. And hopefully that's the case.
Well, they certainly do. Trust me. So Blacktop Wasteland is a fantastic title. Can you tell us a little bit about what the imagery represents and how it came about?
I had a conversation with a friend of mine one time about living in a small town when we were about 17 to 18. We were both talking about how we felt like we were never going to escape this wasteland. And I always thought about there's a road that drives through our town. It ends at the beach, and it starts at the beach, I should say. It takes you out of town and hooks up with an interstate. And then sometimes it felt like you were just driving in a circle. You could never get out of our small town, which is ironic because I ended up moving back here later on. But I just felt like it was this wasteland that we were stuck on, this like blacktop carousel that we couldn't get out. And there were a lot of times where I wanted nothing more than to get out of this small town. And so when I started writing the book, that kind of imagery stayed in my head. Also, I like esoteric titles. I'm the one person in America that likes Reservoir Dogs as a title. And so I like putting words that are incongruous together to make a book title. My next book is titled Razorblade Tears. And so I like the contrarian imagery of razor blades and tears, kind of putting those together. Same thing with a blacktop road and this dystopian wasteland. So I kind of like that imagery. So that's where my titles come from.
Well, I talked a lot to this book messaging expert, Peter Hildick-Smith, and he says that titles, when they can make a reader puzzled by it or intrigued and what it means, it actually is very, very attractive. So I think you've nailed it from a marketing standpoint because people want to know more. And when you said Razorblade Tears, all I could think about was, kind of cutting the face and having the tears, bloody tears coming. So I'm in. I'm
in too, by the way, Sean. But first, before we get to that one, when a reader finishes Blacktop Wasteland and finally takes a breath, what do you want them to take away from the book?
I want them to understand how incredibly difficult it can be to live the best version of your life when everything and everyone around you seems to be conspiring to make you be the worst version of who you are. But I also want them to enjoy the ride. I grew up watching a lot of B movies as a kid. Old Burt Reynolds movies like White Lightning and Gator and Moon Runners and Crazy Larry and Dirty Mary and Boxcar Bertha, which was Martin Scorsese's first directorial debut. But movies like that were really this B movie. Some people call it redneck noir or rural noir. And so I wanted the book to have a little bit of that same feel, but in a more modern sensibility. And so, the scenes of the duster riding down the road, chasing, riding down the road like a great white made of steel and iron and things like that. Those are imageries that were in my head when I would watch those movies. And so I want people to take those images away. But also at the end of the day, I want them to realize that there's a debate right now about genre fiction, I think, that's been going on for a long time. And that, somebody will say sometimes, oh, this is a great book that, it defies the genre, or it rises above its genre trappings or whatever. And I think, I'm not saying this about myself personally, I'm thinking about crime fiction as the general topic. There is incredibly great literature that happens to be crime fiction. There's, Crime and Punishment is about a murder. The Devil All the Time is about various murders and questionable moral decisions. And I think the idea that if something is labeled crime fiction, that it can't be great literature is an unfortunate fallacy that a lot of people have taken for a truth. And so, not saying this about Blacktop Wasteland, but any crime fiction book, Blacktop Wasteland has people getting shot and getting their hands amputated by truck doors, but it's also the story of a man who loves his family, a man who is incapable of moving forward in his life, and someone who, has a idealized version of a father that may or may not still be alive. And it's an emotional journey of a man who needs to grow up, basically. And what does that look like? And what does that entail? And what does that cost? And so I'm very proud that my book is labeled crime fiction. I don't feel that that's an insult or a detriment at all. And I think it's important that the genre gets the respect that it deserves. And so I hope people will take that away from when they finish reading my book, or a book like Winter Accounts, or a book like When These Mountains Burn, or a book like, Hollywood Homicide, or anything that's under the crime fiction genre title does not mean that it's not great literature. And I think those things are not mutually exclusive, and a lot of people seem to think that.
Well said. You have a reputation for being a phenomenal reader, and that is a difficult skill, as we talk to other authors. How do you select the passages, and what tips do you have for someone who might want to read their book but isn't that comfortable?
Find a section in the book that is finite. And what I mean is, it's difficult to drop readers in the middle of a story sometimes. Read your first chapter. That sometimes is your strongest entry into your story. Practice it. A lot of people will not, they'll be asked to read a section from their book and they'll just try to start reading, and that's hard. It's very hard. I use words in the book that sometimes I want to make sure I know how to pronounce them, because I've read them, but I don't know if I'm pronouncing them correctly. So read it out loud and practice. Me personally, I like to do voices. I'm not very good at it, but I like to, just because it helps the reader differentiate between, especially if you've got two characters talking.
Yeah.
And so I think, even, and this is not a thought that's original to me. Gabino Iglesias, who's a great writer and a fantastic reader, he said, and I'm paraphrasing, "You're not reading, you're performing." And I think a lot of writers don't understand that. You're performing, so perform your work. The best writing is writing that can be read, but it also sounds beautiful read out loud. I have a great friend named Eric Pruitt, who's a great writer in his own right, and his books sound amazing read out loud. They're funny, they're interesting, they're exciting. He has great metaphors. I'm jealous of his metaphors. So when you read his books, if he does a live reading, he performs it and it sounds good. So if I would give anybody a piece of advice, if you're writing something, I do this a lot, read it out loud off your computer while you're writing it. Because for me as a reader, one of the most arduous things is reading dialogue that doesn't sound the way people really talk. And it will take me out of a book sometimes. And so that's one thing I miss about with everything going on with the pandemic. I used to love to go to a bar or a restaurant and eavesdrop on people's conversations, not so much for the content, but for the way they were talking, the way they cut each other off in a conversation, the pregnant pauses in the conversation, the soliloquies. People will monologue a lot of times. You sit in a bar, you'll hear somebody monologuing. And so how does that sound and how do people react? And those, to me, are the best pieces of dialogue if you want to put them in your fiction.
That's great advice. So Sean, before we let you go, I wonder if you could tell us a bit more. I'm assuming you're working right now on Razor Blade Tears. So can you tell us a bit more?
Yeah. I'll give you the elevator pitch on that real quick. So Razor Blade Tears is the story of two men, Ike Randolph, Buddy Lee Jenkins, one black, one white, both ex-cons, whose sons, Isaiah and Derek, are murdered about a week after they've been married. And so the police don't seem to be handling the case appropriately or to Ike and Buddy Lee's satisfaction. They suspect that because their sons were gay men, that the police aren't as vested in investigating the crime. So they decide to look into it themselves, not only to find or attain vengeance for their children, but to find a modicum of redemption for themselves. Both of them were in and out of their children's lives because of their prison sentences, but also neither one of them, as their children grew up, were very accepting of their sexuality. And so that entailed everything from arguments to physical confrontations. And so now that their sons have died, have been murdered, they're trying to find a way to fix that relationship and redeem themselves and become better men, even as they cut this wide swath of bloody vengeance through the rural southeastern Virginia.
Wow, I'm looking forward very much to that one. Me too, Ryan?
And that's violent as hell too. So there's a lot. It's not as fast paced as Blacktop, but there's people that get murdered with like shovels and tampers and chopped up in wood chippers and blown up with fertilizer bombs. And so it's fun for the whole family.
R-rated. I love it. Listen, Sean.
Yeah, definitely do not read this to your 12-year-old kids for a bedtime story. But no, the story, I feel as a writer, you need to challenge yourself. You need to push yourself. And one of the things that I wanted to challenge was the homophobia in rural America, and especially homophobia in rural Black America. And I wanted to talk about that. I have a relative who came out at 40, and he was ostracized by some members of his family. And so I wanted to talk about that and what is masculine. I'm fascinated with identity and masculinity, and what do those things mean outside of what is considered traditional definitions. And I also wanted to take a couple of characters that maybe you don't like at first, and hopefully, if I did my job, you grow to appreciate them and respect them for trying to change, trying to be better, and trying to. I don't think anyone is hopeless, but you really have to want to change. A lot of people pay lip service to it, but if you really have a legitimate desire to change, I think you can, but it's not easy, and nothing worth having is. And so I wanted to kind of talk about those things in the confines of a crime novel with, people getting, like beaten to death with wrenches and stuff. So.
Well, I think readers are no doubt going to be excited for that one for sure. Do you know when that one's coming out?
Hopefully, it's going to be next year, probably in the fall, maybe. I just finished the first round of revisions, so I'll probably get another one back. And then final revisions hopefully will be either later on this year or at the first of the year. So, you know how that goes. I wrote this whole book and turned it in. And then my editor, who's a great editor, Christine Kapacik, got Flatiron, got a hold of it. And I was like, oh, no, this is terrible. And it's like, but no, you go in and I think it's a stronger book. Now, that's one thing about the editing process. I think too many people worry about finishing the perfect first draft, and a draft is never perfect. There's things in BLACKTOP WASTELAND that I think I could have done better, things I should change. I feel like I should change. There'll be things in Razor Blade Tears, obviously, and then in my next book as well. But, I think the thing about being a writer is you never feel like you're done, but you have to sometimes realize when you're finished. And I think I know a lot of people who are friends of mine who want to be writers who are still holding on to the first draft, the first thing they ever wrote. and it's a fine line. You know, I don't, you know, if you're a professional, you do the best you can and you turn in the best product you can. But I think as an artist, you have to know when to let your baby go, because if you don't, you'll never write anything. You'll never, and it's not even so much about being published, but you'll never finish anything. You're never done, but you can find a place where you finish. And it's difficult. It's different for everybody. I don't propose to know the secret to that, but for me, I think I'm finished when I've stretched and turned the story as much as I can, and I can't see any more that I can do with the story internally as far as like plot and character development. But there's always things you want to go back and finish. Something I'm thinking of right now that is bugging me about Razorblade Tears. I'll probably tackle again when I get it back for the last go around. But I think all writers are hard on themselves, and you just gotta come to a place where I've done the best I can. I can't do any more with it, and you gotta let it go.
Well, that's great advice, and I couldn't agree more. You know, when it comes to, finishing a book, you always go back and want to edit. And that's why I think it's hard to read the finished product sometimes, because you're internally, right, you're thinking, oh, I should have written this, or I've got a great idea now for that. But like you said, hopefully it's the best book you can do as a writer at that time.
Yep, exactly.
Perfect. Well, listen, thanks again for taking the time to join us. And everyone out there who has not read Blacktop Wasteland, you will be so happy when you do. So enjoy. There you go, a commercial.
Thank you guys for having me. Thank you so much.
No, thank you, Sean, for coming on. I'm seriously like about to go ready buy American Muscle Car and start souping it up now, man. So thank you for coming on. This was great, and we look forward to the next one.
Thank you so much.